the Religion, Society, Culture podcast, presented by Dr. Willie J. Keaton Jr., Season 1. This season I'm calling A Better Society. And this is episode 2, and the title of episode 2 is Vice versus Virtue. Vice versus Virtue. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not die. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. Most of us know the story. Adam and Eve, first two individuals created. God has a bunch of instructions. One of them, do not eat from this tree. And the day that you eat from it, this tree was called the knowledge of good and evil. The day you eat from it, you are to die. As we know, Adam and Eve eventually eat the fruit, blame each other, and they have two sons, Cain and Able. I want to suggest the two sons are the representation of what was declared by God. So Cain and Abel represent the very essence of the fall because they represent the good and evil that's mentioned by God. Because it's quite clear that one son had a pure heart and the other didn't. Good and evil. And in fact, in the story, evil kills good. And so I'd like to replace good and evil with vice and virtue. Because there seems to be this thread or motif with a conversation regarding Cain and Abel, but it seems to continue. Two brothers, Isaac, Ishmael, Jacob, and Esau, the younger brother, the older brother, the sons of Zebedee, one on the right, one on the left. And so that's how I see vice and virtue. That's how I see good and evil sitting on each side of us, one on the right and one on the left. Vice and virtue. It's an important discussion as we're talking about a better society and a redefinition of some of the very same things that we've always been taught. But now there needs to be a reteaching, maybe a reclarification. But vice and virtue in society is very important because a society that is focused on virtue has a chance of sustaining, whereas a society that's focused on vice is headed toward destruction. Classic definition of vice: a desires of the eyes. Classic definition of virtue, desires of the heart. And so what I'm suggesting is, as a society, we are heavy on the vice. Virtue, on the other hand, let's just say we're running on fumes. When we look in the Old Testament, the Bible is talking about a virtuous woman. And in ancient times, of course, wisdom was always understood to be a feminine betrayal, Sophia. So virtuous wisdom is the goal. It's the fruit of the Spirit. It's virtuous, a virtuous life, a virtuous. So the goal, as it pertains to strengthening our institutions, is to build institutions that leads to individuals understanding and having been trained, but having a love for those things that are virtuous. So the scales of society, on one side vice, one side versus, there has to be one side vice, one side virtue, and there has to be a balance of the scales. Vice opens us to a world of temporary pleasure that ends in pain. James says, listen, don't blame it on God when one is enticed by the lust of the eyes. It's the vice that pulls us away from stable and happiness. It's the vice that pulls us away from relationships. It's the vice that motivates us at times to gamble when we shouldn't and betray others when we shouldn't. Imagine a society that every year is producing students that understand that virtue will always come before vice. Vice opens you to pain, but virtue introduces you to destiny, a life of Christ, the life of virtue. Buddha, Gandhi, Martin, Malcolm, Medgar, Mother Teresa, Harriet Tubman, lives of virtue. Vice is the underlying cause of the corruption and exploitation. The more we exploit, the more vice is available to us. The love of money, the root of all evil. Because money fuels and funds the desire for the vices. Virtue says, whether I'm penniless, I will not sacrifice that which I have been trained in understanding to be true. See, if my passion is virtuous, that's what sustains us. It's the old saying, that which is within you will save you. That which is not within you will be your destruction. So the virtue that is within you, that is what we lean upon in the storms of life. You must love one another, hate. You must love one and hate the other. You must love one and hate the other. Do you love vice or do you love? There's no in between. Of course, life is about balance. However, just as you can't be a slave to money and a slave to God, you can't be a slave to virtue and a slave to vice. One will always be master over you. Vice, that's what triggered the prodigal son. Virtue is what he discovered as he makes the journey back home. The vices stir within. Virtue, life of Abel, Noah. God says, I want to begin a new race because all I see is violence and the wickedness has become unbearable. God says, there's no virtue. All there is vice, malice. So we start over. We start with one man, and that is Noah. David is talked about as a man after God's own heart. He wasn't perfect, but he was virtuous. You know, all of the great myths portray the value of virtue to a man's soul. Our culture, our religion, our society, how impacted has our religion, society, culture been because of our overwhelming desire for vice? Religion, all of the things that are going wrong, and that's difficult to say, but it's a reality. More people now are leaving church than they're. What is it? What is that about? How can a conversation regarding vice and virtue fix the path that our religious institutions are on as a society? How do we revisit and reintroduce virtue back to her rightful place in the minds of our society, in the hearts of our society? It's a framework for how we go about living and existing as a community if we are living in the last days. A culture that puts shame where it should be. Those who attempt to live a virtuous life seem to be the ones who deal with the shame of a culture that is heavy on vice. But how do we have that ingrained in our children? How is that embedded virtue? Because one may say we could teach it all day long, but how does it get into the hearts and minds of our children so that they may be the pillars, they may be the foundation of the next society? We might not see the turnaround in our society, but if we were to begin to plant the seeds, how would we go about doing that? Well, one of the things I've thought about is